listeners, good evening, viewers of TDN Radio and This Week in Interview. Welcome to this week's episode. It's always a pleasure to be here with you on a Wednesday evening, and tonight is no exception. I have a very exciting conversation on tap for you. One I know that is quite relevant to all of us because we know the stories of bill. So we're going to talk about your bills. More specifically, we're going to be discussing your interaction with the utility companies, and especially if you are listening to us from the Caribbean, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, you definitely want to tune in because in those countries, the utility companies are pretty much government agencies. And so they have a different shade, it's a different animal from what pertains in North America, in the UK, and so on. So that's what we'll be discussing with my esteemed guest, Miss Anne Marie Christopher, an attorney at law and consumer protection, consumer rights advocate, and she's here with us tonight to really talk about what is a fledgling. It's unfortunately it's still fledgling um, aspect of Caribbean life, which is consumer protection. So, as usual, I want to invite you to share the live, share the link, let people know that this week the interview is live. If you're a regular listener, you know it, and you know that I also appreciate you making the time every Wednesday to spend that hour with us. I really don't take your time for granted. There's so much that you can do with your time, and I'm really honored that you choose to spend that time with us on a Wednesday night. And if tonight is the first time that you're listening to this week in interview, my objective is to make sure that you like what you hear sufficiently that you will also become a regular listener, a regular viewer of this week in interview. Okay, so we're going to take a quick break, share the live, let folks know that we're on, let them know what topic we're discussing, which is consumer protection. And as soon as we come back, I will introduce you to my guest because I'm really chomping at the bit to get to this conversation with Miss Christopher. So stay tuned. All right, so we're back, and I hope you had a chance to invite, as I always say every week invite 5 people to join us on this week in interview. If you're listening to us in Dominica on DigiPlay Channel 59, RVR Jams carries this week in interview live on in Dominica. And in the Toronto area, SBE Online Radio also carries this week in interview live. So good evening to you, the audience in that market. It has been an eventful week since we last saw each other on Wednesday night. We saw some, um, how would you say it? Air dynamics with not Mike Tyson, but somebody tried to bite off the ear of one of the presidential candidates. Um, that has been dominating the news. Those of you who are celebrating anniversaries or graduations or birthdays, congratulations to you, and wishing you many more of those pleasant experiences. Those of us who have experienced tragedy in our families, we wish you grace and comfort as you go through those difficult times. So tonight, what we're discussing tonight is consumer protection and consumer affairs. If you live in North America or in Europe, you're very familiar with your rights as a consumer, as a customer. You're not a stranger that if you do a transaction and you're not satisfied, you can go back to management and you can bring it to their attention. And usually they will try their best to accommodate you. That is not always the case, and it's even less so in the islands of the Caribbean, in the OECS islands. So tonight, that's what we'll be discussing, but we'll be having a special focus on the utility companies, the water company, the electric company, your cable. Uh, Gas is not really piped, so it's not, except maybe like in some of the bigger islands, so you buy your cylinders, but just in general. And one aspect that a lot of those utilities in the islands have is that they're owned by government. The Wasco in Dominica, WASA in St. Lucia, and so on. Um, Lucilec, there is Grentel, all of those agencies, utilities that are owned by government. And therefore, if they're owned by government, technically, by definition, they're owned by you, the people, you, the consumers. But it doesn't feel that way. I'm sure it doesn't feel that way most times when you have to interact with them. I'm coming from a different perspective because those of you who are familiar with my background, you're aware that I used to work at a water company in Dominica. I managed the engineering department at the Wasco for a couple of years, and so I'm familiar with it from that end, and how the impact the impact that we have on consumers can really affect their lives. Water is life. It's not just a cliche, it is true. And then we've come to rely on electricity to where it's almost as essential as water. There are folks who have medication that needs to be refrigerated. There are folks who nowadays you don't cure your meat with smoke or sun anymore. You put it in your refrigerator. So if your electricity service is not reliable, it affects what you eat. I grew up in Castle Bruce in Dominica on the East Coast, and I know what it is not to have any utilities. We had to get water from the river. We had light from candles and from kerosene lamps. We cooked on wood and on coals, and also after a while on propane gas. So there were no utilities. And I remember when pipe-borne water came to the village, and I actually left Castle Bruce and went to university before electricity came to the village. And so when I come back now to the islands, and you see that it has completely changed. We are now dependent on those utilities to where it is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And that's what our topic is going to be tonight. My guest tonight is Miss Anne Marie Christopher. She is an attorney at law practicing in St. Lucia. She was originally called to the bar in the UK in 1997. In addition to advocating for consumers, she represents individuals in debt cases, small claims, regulatory law, and estate planning. She says she is committed to public service, and that is evident through her frequent public seminars that she conducts pro bono. She does help desk and she runs them for consumers so that you can be more familiar with your rights, what rights you have. And so that's where we're going to go tonight with with Miss Christopher. She has tribunal experience and it highlights her significant contributions to dispute resolution. She has served as a magistrate in both the United Kingdom and in St. Lucia. Her role as an arbitrator and a court appointed mediator on the court roster demonstrates her adeptness at conflict resolution. So, how many of you have conflicts with DOASCO, or if your water company, your electric company, your telephone and internet company? She is dedicated to advocacy work, um, unwaveringly so, and she has generously offered her expertise in regulatory environments, legal compliance risk, and secretariat roles. As a founding member of the Sports Academy in St. Lucia and the Mediators Forum, also in St. Lucia, she continues to act as in an advisory capacity to consumer associations and other NGOs. emphasizing her commitment to using her skills for the greater good. More recent outreach is in helping the Bar Association and the OECS Bar Legal Aid. I'm sure this is just the tip of the iceberg, but I'm anxious to bring my guest on, Miss Anne Marie Christopher. Welcome to this weekend interview. It's really an honor to have you on as my guest tonight.
Thank you. You set the bar very high. I hope I can meet that standard tonight. And it really is my pleasure to be here to share with you as a consumer. I'm also a buyer of services.
Right.
So tonight I am a sample consumer, and we hope that people will join in the conversation because I'm sure everybody has a story to tell.
Yeah, and I'm excited about that because I am passionate about people's rights. And I know when I worked at the water company, I used to have the objective of really measuring our uptime. When I say our uptime, really counting times that we had outages with an objective to get 100%. Um, you know, availability and service to the customer, and that used to dictate what we give priority and what we give attention to. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. For those of you who may not know, Anne Marie is of Dominican parentage. At least I know your dad was from Dominica. Can you
Yes.
give a little bit? I mean, I know I gave all of your, not all, most of your professional profile. Would you care to share a little bit of personal, no, so that at least the audience can feel like you're just another regular consumer of the services?
Yeah, first and foremost, I am a buyer of services. So that's how I identify with every single viewer out there and
Right.
listener. Yes, I am Dominican. My father, Don Christopher, was also a people's lawyer. Many of you may know him. He
Yeah.
always stood up for the rights of the consumer, the person on the street. So, yes, I'm just carrying on that legacy for Daddy. Notwithstanding that, over the years, there have been growing concerns over the treatment of consumers of utility, unfair practices, poor service levels, and in particular, the water industry. Water is a right, it is not a privilege. And that's embedded in the UN on consumer guidelines. So it comes right back from the UN. We have consumer protection law in most states. Some of it has not been implemented. And you have rights as utility consumers. It's a shame that a lot of the utility providers do not recognize that they're part of the Consumer Protection Acts or the UN guidance on consumer law. And there's one slide that defines who a consumer is. And for all you regulators, all you suppliers, within the Consumer Protection Act, I don't know if you have that slide, a person who
Sam, can if
is
you're able to pull it up.
a
Go ahead though.
person, any person who is under an agreement on transaction for a service is a consumer, and they have rights under the Consumer Protection Act. Every government has to have policies, rules in the provision of services, consumer information, termination of contracts. This is contract law. So governments have to make sure that they comply with the Consumer Protection Act and also the UN guidelines on consumer protection.
All
So
right.
that's what our starting point.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say I knew your dad when I managed the engineering department at the water company in Dominica. Your dad was the chairman of the board of directors. So we did interact in providing service to the customer. So yeah. Thank you on our behalf for his service, and thank you for what you are doing, what you continue to do. So you've laid the foundation where you've said basically that if you have a water connection, if you have an electricity connection or telephone or internet connection, you are a consumer. and particularly a consumer in the context of our conversation tonight. And as I alluded to, in times gone by, when I was a little boy and utilities were not available in my village, electricity was a luxury. A few people had generators, and we would buy ice from them, or they would use it to refrigerate goods in their shops. But the vast majority of us didn't have. So therefore, those who had could be considered a luxury. When water first came to the village, those people who could afford it got early connections, and those people who could not continued to go to the river for their water and so on. And at that time, water was a luxury. But our society has progressed now to where those items are a right. You said that the UN has produced guidelines, and some countries have even enacted laws. So I guess what you say,
We all should have a
right?
Consumer Protection Act. We all should have implemented the Consumer Protection Act in all the OECS states. However, there has been some lagging behind. In St.
Mhm.
Lucia, it took 24 years for the act to come into force. And even now, we have some challenges. So, a consumer, any person who buys goods or services under the agreement, so utility companies are subject to the act. And a lot of them don't realize that. A lot of them have their own regulatory act, which is not as encompassing as a Consumer Protection Act. They have powers, but the
Mhm.
Consumer Protection Act takes it one step further in terms of the protection of you as a consumer. And
Right.
they can do a lot more in terms of the powers given to the tribunal, the powers of investigation, which we all need to embrace. And this is not something that we can choose to ignore because it came from the Treaty of Chaguaramas. Everybody was supposed to have an act in force. I don't know how many of the OECS islands have actually implemented it. And without implementation, there really is no act. But what you do, the countries then tick off that they have a Consumer Protection Act, albeit that it's not functional. So that's one of the challenges that we have in the OCS, in the wider region. We have these acts that are just gathering dust. Some countries, like Dominica, have not implemented it. They haven't even passed it, I believe.
They have
So
not
there is
enacted
some
it.
work. They have not enacted it. So there
Wow.
are no rights. So as I said, this is coming down from the UN to the Treaty of Chaguaramas into individual domestic law.
Right.
So
And
one of the
for
examples.
those of you who may not be as familiar, the Treaty of Chaguaramas, particularly the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, is what set up CARICOM in its current format. So what Ms. Christopher is saying is that not only if you are signatory to the UN, you're obligated to have that Consumer Act. She's also saying that as a CARICOM country and you're a party to the Treaty of Chaguaramas, you have a you also have it there as well as a requirement. So you describe yourself as a consumer protection advocate. So what are some of the, how would you say it, short-term goals, objectives? What are some of the actions that you would like that we the consumers need to see passed or enacted so that we can feel that we have a framework within which we can be protected?
Okay, well, the big thing is to have a framework that actually works.
Right.
So while we have this system is an example of St. Lucia,
Mm-hmm.
we have the Consumer Affairs Department. They're supposed to investigate. And then we have a Consumer Council, and this will be similar across all OECS states.
Right.
And then the tribunal who hear the matter. This needs to be implemented so it actually works. And with that, it needs to be a transparent process that you, the consumer, can see what's coming out of it, can see the statistics, and that can be used to improve the system. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't know any state that actually produces any report about what's happening in this tribunal, what's happening in the council, how many cases have they had, what statistics, what are the learning objectives. So while you have the act and you have, in theory, these beings, it's not working because we don't see anything and we're not learning.
Right.
So that is a framework in St. Lucia. It is similar in Dominica and all the other OECS, albeit the Consumer Council is something else, a consumer board. So what we need to do is make sure that the regulatory framework is working.
Hmm.
A second thing, and the regulators and the Consumer Affairs Department have a duty to educate the public as to their rights and also their obligations. So if you lodge a complaint, you should be given information. So not only implementation, we need to be able to tell people, and I don't know at what stage it is in your jurisdiction, but how many people know about the Consumer Protection Act? How many people have actually been given information about how the system works and where they can go for redress? So those are two things that we need to step up, and it needs to be monitored. I don't know what the OECS Commission is bonded to do or CARICOM, but is this thing being monitored? Who's checking to see what's coming out of the system? Do people know where to go?
Right.
So, some action points there. And from I have been through the system in St. Lucia. I'm currently lodged a complaint against WASCO, and I am starting to see some discrepancies in terms of transparency and the treatment of people when they go into these tribunals or in terms of the regulator.
Hmm.
So we need to have a transparent process. We need to report the outcomes. It needs to be fair and be seen to be balanced. And the national consumer associations in each jurisdiction must be given the support of government, but be independent enough to take these matters forward. They
Right.
also need to be able to advocate and explain to people that they're there to help. You see, the consumer associations are at the bottom because they can feed complaints into the system, into the Consumer Council or board, which goes up to the tribunal.
Right.
So it's
Right. Right.
very
So,
important that we have that.
so in the short term, we really need to have not only the implementation of the Consumer Protection Board, the Consumer Protection Council, but there need to be a really robust education campaign so people are even aware that that exists and that's an area for recourse. Is that what I'm hearing that you're saying? That that
Correct.
is
And
where we are.
there needs to be accountability in
And
each of those
accountability.
functions as
Right.
to what they're doing, what
Right.
statistics, how much effort they're making to resolve complaints, what type of complaints are coming out, what sectors they're finding. None of this is happening, not from where I stand.
Right.
And
And
as a
and so because those utilities are owned by government, folks might feel a little intimidated to, I don't know, challenge them, take them on. They might feel they don't have the resources because the government is this big, powerful entity. And in the Caribbean, usually the biggest employer is the government by far. So many things go through the government, and so folks are reluctant. How would that framework account for that so that consumers can feel a little more comfortable representing their rights?
One of the major players in the whole regime is the consumer associations.
Hmm.
They're independent of the government. They're there to support each and every consumer as they go through the process. They're there to help. The
Right.
Consumer Affairs Department also has a role to play. So if everybody is doing their job, then we'll have a fair complaints, adequate complaint system.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that is perhaps where we need to strengthen that complaint system. I've had people come to me as a consumer advocate. They've gone to the Consumer Affairs Department and they've been told to go and sort it out with the supplier. And I have several cases, banks. I've had another one with a utility where it appears that there is some blockage for the consumer affairs departments to be able to move it up to the council and move it up to tribunal. So I'm saying that as a consumer advocate, we need to ensure that when somebody makes a complaint, they're not referred to go and sort it out themselves with the suppliers. That's one avenue
Hmm.
that I would like to see addressed. The lack of compensation is another issue,
Hmm.
particularly with the water suppliers. What we do have is a series of disruptions. Uh, if you go and buy any product and they're not providing the service, there is a compensatory measure, correct?
That should be, yeah.
Right. So, why is it that the utility companies can stop your service, have disruptions, and they're not accountable for giving you compensation? I do see that Jamaica has made some progress in that area because there's a standing charge and they have a whole template of compensatory measures if they have a lack of service. So, congratulations to Jamaica. I think Trinidad and Barbados are on the same par. But the OECS countries, you literally have no service, but you're still having a standing charge. For what?
And I guess Dominicans would also feel that about the electricity company, because they started load shedding again um,
Yeah, well,
last week.
share more about that scenario.
So uh, la- in the last few months, last year, towards the end of last year, the electric company uh, in Dominica, they generate electricity through hydro and through diesel generators. The diesel generator broke down around the same time that the production for hydro was low. So the electric company did not have the capacity to supply what electricity to the entire country. And so they had to ration electricity. So you're not going to have any power so that we can give this some and so on. But in that whole framework, I never heard anything about, well, in return for you not having the service for an aggregate of 40 hours in a month, we are going to give you a credit against your next bill of so much money. And so the the gripe, I guess, that you are talking about in most of the other islands, which would deal with water, Dominicans would also have it with electricity. And so what you're saying is that in that whole process of developing the framework, it's a process of holding the utility feet to the fire to say, hey,
Yeah.
you have a standard to maintain. If you don't maintain that standard, here are the consequences.
And the regulators are guardians and they need to step up. Okay. They need to review and the terms and conditions of providers.
Hmm.
They need to look at things like disconnection policies. I give an example. We have one sub provider who shall remain nameless who will just disconnect you without adequate notice. And when I say adequate notice, that is advance notice of a scheduled disconnection. And that's very important. Notice of a date of disconnection, notice of how much you need to pay, and giving the consumer an opportunity to rectify the situation before get cut off. I was just cut off one day for a bill of 250 something dollars. I had no notice. I was not called. I was still paying during a period when I wasn't being supplied. So, on what basis? It's basic contract law. If you say you're going to provide a service and you do not provide a service, how can you then go and disconnect somebody without giving them an opportunity to at least address it? So these are things that we need to look at. The disconnection notices, there's some issues with that in terms of what they call the red hand rule in law. In my country, we have please ignore the disconnection notice if your bill is up to date. That is not a disconnection notice. That's on the front, and the conditions of disconnection are on the back in a sort of gray color. not within a font size that the average person can read. So if water is disrupted also during this period, then do you have a right to disconnect? So
Right.
these are the issues that I'm bringing to the fore. You're not entitled to also charge a standing charge of $24, $25 if you're not meeting your obligation under a contract. And our Consumer Protection Act actually specifies, and it's the same in your jurisdiction, Section 94, you're not entitled to demand or accept a payment if at the time you do not intend to supply goods, materials, and have no reasonable belief that you have grounds to charge. Or, so, as I said, the Consumer Protection Act has that clause in it, and it's the same. You cannot expect to charge people if you're not supplying at the time. You're in breach of contract.
Right.
One of our problems in the Caribbean is that you don't complain. Okay, I'm English. English people always complaining. We have to shift that culture that don't talk to your neighbor, oh, we don't have water, the light's gone. Put a notice in. Go online. They should have it online where you can report a fault.
Right.
But what we tend to do is that we in the market, complain to our friends, put it in writing, because once it's in writing, they have to deal with it. And then we can get aggregate statistics about where the breaches are and the failure in terms of the Consumer Protection Act and also the Regulators Act. So it's your duty to complain.
Right. And so there is the Consumer Protection Act and the regulatory act or framework. Most people in the Caribbean only know about regulators when a utility applies for a rate increase. I think that is the most common role in the media. So the electric company wants to raise their rates, they
Mm-hmm.
apply to the regulatory commission
Mm-hmm.
to justify the rate increase, and they get a yes or no. I think most people think that that is the role of the regulators. The part about protecting the consumer from poor service, from poor quality of product,
Mm-hmm.
and for basically strong arming them, because the utility company has the ability to disconnect you. What do you as a customer have the ability to do? Withhold payment? Then they disconnect, then they justified in disconnecting you. And so that education campaign, that need for that robust education of the public is of paramount importance. And so what is the obligation of the government then to make sure that they have an informed public about those rights as consumers?
Well, all the governments are signatories to the UN. That's the ultimate. You are also obligated under the Treaty of Chaguaramas, also obligated to put into force and implement a Consumer Protection Act. So you have that responsibility as a government, and to also to make sure that there are enforcement measures available to the various entities. I'll give you an example of enforcement. I have one of the screens, and it shows the type of things that, as a tribunal, they can implement. And it's down to the government to make sure that that process is working effectively. I don't know if you have that slide, but it gives lots of different things that can happen.
Mhm.
Okay, loss of injury suffered by consumers, failure to observe consumer rights. There's statutory penalties under the Consumer Protection Act, which is not available under the Regulators Act. Orders at the tribunal, they can do lots of things. They can bind agreements, pricing of goods, pay, they can replace goods, they can do just about anything that a magistrate can do.
Oh,
But
wow.
you see, they have the same powers, but also on the blue screen, they have statutory powers to impose fines. Yes, I wanted you to go to that slide. Non-compliance with suppliers' duties. There's a fine there. Engaging in unfair trade practices. Failure to observe consumer safety requirements. So, as I said, there's a whole regime under your Consumer Protection Act, and it's every state, which is way above the UK, the Regulators Act. That is why it's so important to make sure this framework actually works. Because once you start finding the regulators, once you start finding the utility companies, then they'll start to take notice.
Right, right. So I'm past my break time. We're going to have to take a quick break to acknowledge our sponsors. Folks, I hope you are finding this conversation as useful as I am finding it. It's all in the progress of our islands as we start to move into that next level of development where we have to have those kind of protection and those type of measures in place that speak directly to the quality of life of our citizens. My guest tonight on this weekend interview is Miss Anne Marie Christopher. She is an attorney at law with a practice in St. Lucia, but she is involved in consumer advocacy throughout the OECS, throughout the Caribbean, as a matter of fact. You see her passion coming through as she speaks about the subject of abuses by utility companies and the suffering of our folks who may feel helpless, um, getting very poor service, getting very little service, and still be required to honor a bill on a monthly basis. So let's get a quick quote from our sponsor. When we come back, we will continue our conversation. I'm going to ask Ms. Christopher what are some of the more regular complaints that she sees from customers, and you will tell me if some of those are what you experience as well as you consume electricity, water, telephone, internet, and so on. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. And you will be a happy consumer, and you wouldn't need a consumer protection because they are very, as I said, they're very reliable and very professional. Uh, we tonight our guest is Miss Anne Marie Christopher. She is an attorney at law and a consumer advocate based out of St. Lucia, doing work to really develop the consumer protection, consumer rights. I don't want to say industry, but environment in Dominica that affords protection to consumers of utilities. Uh, she spoke about a few areas that our consumers are suffering from, where sometimes the service is not there, but they're still disconnected because they continue to expect to pay for a service that they're not getting. We spoke about the regulators and the responsibility that they have in terms of consumer protection, and of course, the role that consumer associations should play. So, what you can do in your own country, wherever you are, you can find out more about the existence of consumer associations. Do they exist? Who's on them? Do they have meetings? Can you become involved with them? And so on. Didi Easter is saying, don't forget, load shedding started after the government took over Domlec. So the people do not have any recourse when their foods get spoiled or their appliances get damaged as a result of the disruption of service. And of course, we spoke a little bit about that because the government represents you, but the government also the one providing the service. Who do you complain to? And Miss Christopher was very eloquent in that she says that is where the role of a consumer association comes in, because then you don't have to go fight a utility company by yourself. You can go with the consumer association at your back. A big part of what we are lacking in these islands is a matter of data collection. I told you that when I worked at the water company as engineering manager, one of the areas that I tracked to measure performance was the level of uptime. So we would actively track any outages, any unplanned outages that we had in and tracked as well and planned as well. So we would be able to, at the end of every period, put out a report that says, in Castle Bruce, the water um, service was interrupted for 5% of the time during the month of May, whatever year. And we would have targets that we would set, and based on that, we would do things like go around the country and take samples from from most of the standpipes in all the areas. I think the Wasco still does that. So at any point in time, you could go to the Wasco and see a record of the quality of water that was produced, that was delivered to the customer, whether it was sufficiently disinfected to be safe for drinking. That is actually recorded. Those samples were brought back to the lab and they were tested and so on. So, Anne Marie, let's start this other session with you just talking about some of the main complaints that you're hearing from consumers. What are some of the more common experiences that they have that need improvement on behalf on the side of the utility companies?
Okay, they come under several general headings.
Hmm.
And complaints handling and how the regulator and how the utility company handles complaints is a bugbear. The notices and the process being explained to the consumer, them having adequate timeframes as to when this is going to be sorted or solved. I had one case that went through a utility company that took something like 6 years.
Wow.
And it was back and forth, back and forth. And the person was complaining about the quality of the water. It took that long. So we need to have adequate complaints handling with accountability. Another area is
Certificate.
the prolonged
Wow.
water shortages or
Hmm.
electricity
Hmm.
outages.
Hmm.
You need to report to the providers, and you need to, every time there's a problem and it's prolonged, keep a record. Utility companies need to also have contingency planning, and don't expect the consumer to have to go and buy water or ship them in at their cost. Contingency planning, communication over when you're going to have outages. They have schedules of where they're going to turn the water off or the electricity in an area. Common decency is to let you people know that there is going to be a shortage. It's a variation in supply, a variation in the terms and conditions of what you're supposed to be giving the consumer. So at least let them know.
Right.
Don't just go to the tap and find there's no water. There's a lot of complaints about the water rates and the billing system. A lot of people don't understand it. I know
Mm.
many providers have a graph or some explanation, but I think there needs to be more public outreach of how the rates are determined, transparency in the rate setting, information about the rate calculations that we can all understand. Another area is failure to provide adequate service. Utility companies and also the internet providers. Regulators, you need to step up. You have an authority to investigate complaints, and people should be told about that right to complain. Encourage complaints, acknowledge them. But I don't know how many people have had no internet, for example. They ring somebody, but this doesn't actually get through to the regulator. And it's down to you as a consumer to also make sure that you're complaining when service is poor. We need clear policies under which compensation is due. We've already talked about that. Clear policies about when you're going to disconnect somebody. That needs to be graphic. It needs to be on your websites, your complaints policy. I was surprised to find at the back of my water bill, if you have a complaint, go to the regulator. Excuse me? There's a middle bit. How can you tell a consumer to go to NERC on the back of your bill when you know full well that you have to deal with complaints? So the back of the bill is incorrect. It's like saying go to the regulator. When you go to the regulator, they're telling you to go back to the supplier and you're going back and forth. So a complaints policy needs to be online, it needs to be transparent. Another area is disconnection notices. We've spoken about that. Water is disrupted. You should not be charging and you should not be disconnecting people. And the Consumer Protection Act has provisions, terms of conditions, charging consumers for assistance. So you're not supplying me, but then you can give me water at a certain charge. Unfair trade practices. There needs to be a thorough review, a working party to review all utility providers and their compliance with the Regulators Act, compliance with the Consumer Protection Act. We need to start looking, because it's the same problem in all the jurisdictions to a varying degree.
Right.
I was very impressed with St. Vincent and their website, because on there they actually told you how much the penalty fee was. In St. Lucia, nowhere is it mentioned how much you're going to have to pay. It's not in the terms and conditions. We don't even get a terms and conditions. I've been asking my regulator, I've been asking my supplier for my terms and conditions. What did I sign? Under the Consumer Protection Act, they have a duty, and it's regulated that they must supply with the terms of your agreement. But in it, it doesn't say that they're going to charge you $100 if you're disconnected. It's not till they disconnect you that you see it on the bottom of the slip
The
after the
reconnection fee.
disconnection. That's after the event. So we need to start looking at these types of issues with disconnections, giving adequate fair notice, giving people a chance. And we've repeated that. A working party across all the OECS countries to improve the service to international standards. Another area is water bills being excessively high. Okay, we have a responsibility to make sure that we haven't got leaks. We need to call our utility suppliers, ask for a review of the meter reading. And if you don't have any luck, don't just sit there. Write to the regulator. Okay, people are not prepared to go to that step. I don't think many people have the confidence, they're not sure. And they say, well, it's not going to make any good. But if enough of you complain, they're going to have to take notice.
Yep.
Regulators, you need to ensure that the utility providers are investigating the bills. What monitoring are you doing? We need guidelines for accurate meter readings and transparency in the bills. And there are some, Jamaica seems to be leading the pack in terms of their compliance with the Consumer Protection Acts. We need a model regulator that we can all take some good ideas, and we need examples of bad regulators, and we need to expose them. Rights regarding the quality of water. Consumers, you have a right to clean, drinkable water.
Right. Not just water.
Not just
safe
water.
and clean, right?
And it must meet health standards set by the regulators. And you have to request a quality test of your regulator or your water provider. So you need to take it one step further. The regulators also have a role to play. And that is an area of looking at themselves, trying to get feedback. Consumer surveys. When last did you ever see a consumer survey from a regulator? Public polls? Because everybody's complaining, but have you actually tested the water to see what the complaints are about?
Right.
You remember we have sustainable development goals internationally. So if you're not meeting those goals, information to consumers, what is the current situation? What challenges are people facing? Are we receiving fair treatment if we go through the complaints process? And I have a story to tell, but I'll save that for next week. Okay, it's still going through a regulatory process, but
Hmm.
I will expose it. I don't care because, as I said, I am lucky that I'm one of the educated consumers.
Right.
So I'm currently testing the system here as a complainant. And there will be a report. Consumer International is aware of some of the issues. The regulatory authority, regulator of regulators, is aware of some of the issues. And once we start documenting this and complaining, then we will then start to see a change.
That is a change. And as I said, you know, these services are not luxuries. That they call utilities for a reason. They are essential, and it shouldn't be that we're getting bare minimum and we're scratching and fighting to get a certain minimum level of service. This is a low hanging fruit where we can really have an impact on the quality of life of our people. That there's running water when you turn on your tap, what clean water flows from your tap. When you flip a light, your switch when you flip a switch, your light comes on. When you pull your fridge, your goods are properly stored in your fridge. That contributes to the quality of life of the people, and so it's important. And I heard you talk about you mentioned Consumer International. So is that a higher level where if your consumer association, a regulatory body, is not as responsive as you would like them to be, is that a further step that you
Okay,
have access to?
Consumer International
Hmm.
is an organization for consumer advocates.
Mm.
They do publish reports, they do get feedback. It's not a direct link for members of the public to go and complain. However, if there is an ongoing issue in a region and it's brought to their attention, they're likely to publish something.
Right.
As I said to you, it's not a direct source. I'm also in touch with the regulator of regulators for the utility companies, and they themselves have conferences, have awareness sessions, and I'm actually speaking as a consumer at the next regulators conference. So I am coming there as a consumer to explain to the regulators some of the things that they need to look at.
Right.
These are not direct access for consumers, but you already have. You must lobby for your Consumer Protection Act to become implemented. By now, everybody should have a Consumer Protection Act with a consumer tribunal and a process that flows. And you need for them to be accountable to
Right.
what they've been doing. We've had our tribunal in force now since 2021, I believe. What are they doing?
Are
Where are
they
the
busy? Do,
stats?
uh, do, do they have a lot of cases?
Who knows?
Hmm.
Nothing's coming out of it.
Nothing is coming out. Wow.
And another issue is that when you raise a complaint, you can go to the regulator of the utility or you can go down the consumer protection framework.
Hmm.
A consumer can do both. Nobody can tell you you have to go to the regulator because they have their own challenges, which I'm finding. Okay? As I said, the Consumer Protection Act regime is far wider in scope. And nobody can tell you as a utility consumer, you have to go to their regulator. You can also go to the court. You can go to all three if you want to
Right.
at the moment. And those options should be made known to you.
Right.
Nobody can force you to go to Wasco's regulator here. All right. But at the same time, the Consumer Affairs Department and the Consumer Council and Tribunal need to be shown and accountable and to be shown to the public what they're doing. How is the act working? What complaints are you having?
Right. I mean, even basic things like, do you know how to contact your regulators? Do you know how to contact your consumer association? Who are the people? What's the phone numbers? How to leave a message? all of that,
Well, it should be on the websites of all the consumer tribunals across the OECS and the region. It should be.
if they have a
And
website.
also, I have a very nice poster that's done by our Consumer Affairs Department telling us about their rights, telling us
Mhm.
about how to complain. So they're doing a good job in terms of information, but they must walk the talk.
Right, right. So Dominica now has to get to that point where they get to that point where they disseminate the information, do the awareness, and continue along where they actually take action.
And it
So,
has to be a joined up approach. The association working with the government consumer council affairs, it needs to be a, a full,
coordinated.
because as I said, we're all there for the consumer,
Right.
you.
Yeah. The public. And it's a public good. The water belongs to the public. The electricity belongs to the public because the diesel is bought if your taxpayers' money. The water belongs to you. So they actually selling you your what belongs to you. What you're really paying for is the facility to capture it and bring it to you in a format where it's useful and where it's convenient. But it's really your product that they're selling, and so consumers have a right to know. You have a responsibility to know your rights. So if nothing else that you get out of tonight's conversation is to know that you should know your rights as a consumer. And once you know that you have a right as a consumer, what are the different bodies, the organization, the boards, the council, the regulators, what are they in place, who's on them, how do they get appointed, how long do they serve for, how do you get in touch with them, what are their phone numbers, where are their offices located. You as a consumer need to know those things, because the more you know is better informed, and therefore you'll be less intimidated if you need to go there. So we've exhausted an hour, believe it or not. I am going to give you the opportunity. I know we covered a really broad spectrum, but I feel like we laid a really good foundation that the audience can take and really move it forward, really go educate themselves and find out what's in there. I, are there areas that you really would have liked to have touched on that we didn't have another chance to talk about as yet? In other words,
I
uh-huh.
do believe that we've given a broad overview. Each area has its own
Yeah, you
action
can deep
plan.
dive. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, but for you as a consumer, you need to support the national consumer associations. Go and find them, go and join them, because there's power in numbers. I'm just one, but can you imagine if there were hundreds of me
Mhm.
in every island? I think we'd be a force to reckon with, don't you?
I think so too.
So
You know.
let's let's get together as a group for the benefit of our fellow consumers. And every single one of you is a consumer of utilities.
Mhm.
Okay, and the regulators and the suppliers need to form a working party to review all the areas that we've covered to ensure that they're giving and they're living up to their responsibilities.
Yeah, and that's the biggest takeaway. Educate yourself. Use what we spoke about tonight as your a wake up, your awareness. Don't just agree that you were disconnected and you scramble and run and pay them so they can come back and reconnect you. Document the quality of service, document your outages, find out who you can give that information to so they can make use of it. Demand to see some record of the performance of your utility company, their uptime, their quality, and so on, because we really are talking about life and death. There's so many people who are diabetic and their insulin is on their fridge. What happens if load shedding is in your area and it is for X number of hours? Is your insulin still safe? Can you still use that insulin? What impact does it have on your health? If your water is gone and it comes back, Is it at what point are you supposed to use it? Is it still adequately disinfected that it's safe to use? And all of
And
those
what
things
compensatory measures are the regulators going to oversee for this
oversee.
type of disruption? Also, vulnerable consumers, that's a whole ball game. There
Yeah.
needs to be special measures for people who have vulnerabilities.
Yes.
And it's not you having the duty, it's the regulators also having a duty to find out, okay,
Right.
people's circumstances.
And to
It's a
make sure that
two-way,
people can access the service.
absolutely.
Certainly. All right. So I think, like you said, we covered a really broad base. We set a solid foundation. I would love to have you come back so we can build on that and to really continue the education. Because one of the things that we said very early is that a robust education activity is required. And so, open invitation. Let's see how we can organize to have you back. But I want to say thank you for the advocacy work that you do, and to wish you strength to continue to do that. And it's Ash Wednesday. Well, you don't call it Ash Wednesday because it's not officially Ash Wednesday, but Carnival was this week in St. Lucia, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I
And
hope you had a
we're all waking up. We're all just got over the little hangovers and things, but yes.
so I hope that you guys had an enjoyable time, and keep us informed with your case. We would love to hear your story when you're ready to tell
There
it.
will be a documentary on the whole event, a learning opportunity that we can share.
Oh,
So,
certainly.
yes, you will see a lot more. And we're not going to just focus on utilities, we're going to look at financial services, the banks, the telecoms industry. So, it's about understanding how these companies work and their specific requirements in terms of consumer protection.
To consumer protection and your rights as a consumer of their service and their goods. So, Ms. Christopher, I want to tell you thank you very much for
It's
your
been a
time
pleasure.
and for sharing your expertise and for all that you do. Didi East saying timely discussion, very informative and sound advice, keeping your father, the late Don Christopher legacy alive with your advocacy service. Come full circle. Thanks for service rendered to the people in the region. There you go. Folks
Yes,
are showing appreciation for what you do. And so, on their behalf, I'm telling you, thank you one more time. And we'll do this again soon. Okay, good night. So, folks, there you have it. I hope you agree with me that this was a really great conversation with Miss Christopher. She's a consumer advocate. She's passionate about consumer rights. If nothing else, I want you to take from this is that you have rights, and you have a right to know your rights and to seek compensation when the quality of service, when the level of service doesn't meet standards. And so let's approach it with the same vigor and passion that we approach Carnival, and let us see how we can move, we can level up, so that the quality of life in the region can really benefit from a better quality of service from our utility companies, and then that will automatically extend to the other major and minor institutions that serve us as consumers. So, folks, good night. We will see you again next week, Wednesday, when we'll have another episode of This Week in Interview. It was such a pleasure having you. Good night, folks.